to attend a personal audience with Pope Paul VI. And she helped put the Farm Workers Credit Union on its feet by purchasing more than $1,000 worth of shares. She gave $500 to a small, struggling farm school in Vermont. She put money with food on the path of her life's work by paying her tuition into a liturgical art course. She donated $30,000 to help start a housing walk in Washington Heights, $1,000 to a civil rights activist Marjorie Early, another $1,000 to a rural advancement fund. During one month in the early 1970s, Dorothy sent out more than $3,000 to a home for mothers, the Medgar Evers Fund, and other Catholic worker houses. She gave money to PBS, to Nilo Dolce, and to the Committee for Artistic and Intellectual Freedom in Iran. She helped people pay rent, tuition for nursing school, real estate school, special needs school, and for a graduate program application fee. She gave money to local churches, credit unions, and co-ops, and provided seed money for home centers. She paid doctor's bills and car repairs and bought computers for the School for Children with Developmental Disabilities. There's a rumor she helped young women attend opera school. I'd like to come back as an opera singer, she once said. That I could bring beauty into people's lives rather than tell them what's wrong with the world. And who would even begin to have a sense of sheer numbers of meals eaten, shelter given, clothing handed out, and visits to hospitals, jails, and courts. All part of that practical, visible, miraculous globe. Thank you.
You want to stand? Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine. So I'd love to open this for questions, and Rita, if you could just choose people.
Yes, sure.
Otherwise, because I won't see everyone who raised their hand.
Can I ask the first question?
Of course, you can ask the first question.
Okay. So in your book, it's clear that your okay. The description of Dorothy Day in your book, there's a lot, you talk about, the great things that your grandmother did, but also about her many flaws. So my question is, she is considered a saint. She's a servant of God, right? How do you reconcile the two?
Oh, there's no problem there. I mean, as I quoted her, she said the saints they're a strenuous lot. If you read the lives of the saints, I think you'll discover, some pretty interesting lives. And I think that's the beauty of it. That's what makes it possible for us to live holy lives. And I think that's certainly what she said. She said that we're all meant, called to holiness, is what she said.
But we're probably not all going to be canonized. So what?
No, but that's not the goal for any of us.
Right. But what is it? What is it that makes her a saint? So if we all have flaws, but we're not all saints. But she is being considered for canonization. So, and also you also believe that she's a saint. So I mean, I don't think everybody is worthy of that title, right? So what is it? She's flawed, but what is it that makes somebody, in spite of their flaws, what is that one thing, that special thing that she had?
I don't think you can tie it down to one special thing. Certainly from the point of view of examination of her life by the church. I mean, the very first thing that they're asking is, did she live a life of heroic virtue? What that means from their point of view, I don't know. In terms of examining her life, I certainly believe that she did live a heroic life. She sacrificed a huge amount, and she lived at the Catholic order, which was always very difficult for her personally. But that's not it either. I think we're talking about a great mystery here, aren't we? I mean, what makes a person so powerful that they change us in ways that aren't normally recognized in our society. I mean, I think when we think about powerful people, we think about economic power, we think about political power, we think about people who can influence you in ways that are not fundamental, that don't change the reality in a way, that don't turn things on their heads, that aren't. I mean, this is all mysterious to me, and I think it's to all of us. I mean, there are things that you can't quantify. Of course, the whole canonization process is a specific, canonical, bureaucratic process. And so they have to examine, well, did she live a life of royal virtue? Again, I can't really say what that means, but it has great meaning to them. And they also, examining possible miracles. There has to be 2 miracles. So there is this process that she needs to go through. To me, I have a hard time kind of getting my head around that because she was so, you can't pigeonhole her. You really, she represents such an array, her life represents such an array of thinking and speaking and action and she can drive people to the wall because in one paper, one column, she'll say this, and then a couple of weeks later, she'll say the exact opposite. And this is really hard to kind of, most of us can't deal with that. But someone once said that the sign of a genius is that they can hold 2 paradoxical things together, one in each hand, and both be equally true. And I think that's one of her mysteries too, that she could do that. I know I'm not answering the question satisfactorily, but this is, I have no answers. I mean, when I say I believe she's a saint, I think that has to do with this ability to change things in miraculous ways, and I'm not talking about, a medical cure, and that actually is the definition of a miracle in this process, that there has to be a medical cure and it has to be documented by doctors, and there has to be no other reason for the cure. And that is the definition of a miracle in this process. And I'm like, well, there are so many different kinds of miracles, and we can't even begin to define them, I think. And I think that's true when we meet someone who has that ability to, change our perceptions of the world, change our perceptions of ourselves, change. I have met so many people who said, I met your grandmother when I was 18 years old, I heard her speak for 20 minutes, she changed my life. What kind of power is that, and how do you define it? I think that's a really difficult thing.
Thanks. Yes. John?
Yeah, I hear a lot about how Dorothy changed lives. Can you comment, was there any sort of locus of change in her? Was there change in her throughout her life?
Yes, absolutely. The question was there any change throughout my grandmother's life? Absolutely. And this was one of the things that I really wanted to do with this book, is to show her how she changed throughout her life. I think we have a tendency to kind of cherry pick from her life, the moments that we really like, that we agree with. And also I think we have a tendency to think that, well, she had this life before she was a Catholic, that she had this life after she became a Catholic, and that was it. And it's not true at all. Her conversion really was an incredibly long lifetime process, and it probably began when she was a child. She certainly, I kind of alluded to this, what my mother referred to as her severe pious stage, a very interesting time in the 1940s in which she really was quite severe and really demanded a lot from people, and that changed. She really wanted to. She was a very strong-willed person, and she really asked a lot of people that came to the worker. And as the years went on, this is just one element that comes to mind, but as the years went on, that really, she knew that she was judgmental. She would rush to judgments, and she would get herself in trouble. She would say things to people that she would regret, and then she would apologize beautifully. and she kept doing that. I mean, that was just, it was her character that she had to struggle with. But she also, I think, really, as she aged, she loosened up a great deal. She said, how can we know what's in the hearts and minds of others? We barely know what's in our own hearts and minds. So, there was a lot of, in the early days, rigidity, which was, that's a whole other discussion for another time, about why she became so rigid. There was a whole array of historical reasons why that happened. But that certainly eased as she grew older and wiser.
One of the few flaws that I experienced in your magnificent tour de force was the subtitle. So I'm so glad you pointed that out. And for me, one of the most eye-opening aspects of the book was your portrait of your father. Tremendous raw honesty. And if you're comfortable sharing it, since his name has not come up in the course of the conversation, I wonder if you could speak about the impact of mental health and alcoholism on your family, and also how your 6 surviving siblings found your work to be cathartic.
Okay. Yes, my father, a profound discovery when I was researching this book and reading his diaries. My parents, as I said earlier, my parents had 9 kids. They both were very devout Catholic. And a year after I was born, my parents separated, legal separation. And never got divorced, never remarried. But there was a lot of unanswered questions for me in terms of what happened between my parents. And in the course of researching this book, I read his diaries. Beware of reading your parents' diaries. I'm very grateful to have read his diaries. It was very hard physically because his handwriting was horrible and I was rolling my eyes. But I persevered because I needed to know why was he the way he was. It was so important to me in this book to not only talk about my grandmother and my mother, but also talk about the men that they loved. So that included my grandfather, particularly my grandfather and my father. So I persevered, and in the course of reading his diaries, I discovered that my father's first love when he was a young man was a young man. And this basically probably was the seeds of his destruction, self-destruction. He died believing that he was going to hell. And when I discovered, and I kept saying to my mom, why did he believe that? Why did he believe that? It just didn't make sense to me. My mother had forgiven him. We had forgiven him. We all had made amends with him as best we could. But there was still this question, why did he believe he was going to hell? And when I read this diary, of course, everything fell into place. And when I told my siblings about this, they're like, it makes total sense. I mean, it's so much of his life that was a mystery to us. Suddenly became quite clear. So that's that. In terms of the alcoholism and mental illness, my mother, I asked her, and this is in the book, I said, was it alcoholism? And she would say no, and she said no. And I said, was it mental illness? And she said no, and she wouldn't go any further. So I think, everything that he died as a devout Catholic. Now, my mother left the church, and I think this is one of the reasons why she left the church. She really did not, she could not take on the teachings against homosexuality. She believed that we're all children of God, and it was very hard for her to kind of exclude people. And it was very hard, it was devastating for her to choose to end the marriage for the sake of her husband's mental health. And that was a huge sacrifice on her part.
And what was your siblings' reaction to your work?
Okay, yes, I'm getting to that. And my siblings' reaction to my work, it was so essential that I had their support. And they were my first readers, apart from my husband. As I said, there are 6 of us. Well, there's 7 of us surviving.
I gave the manuscript, big fat manuscripts from each of my siblings, made them read it, and said, if there's anything in there that you do not want published, tell me and I'll take it out. I gave them total right to do that. Because I felt like I was opening a lot of wounds in this story, and I felt I had to open these wounds, but it was also equally imperative that I close those wounds as best as I was able. And so the miracle was not one single thing did they ask to take out. They gave me complete support for this book, and they have continued to give me complete support for it. I made them cry a lot. I made myself cry a lot. But I think, ultimately, I hope and I think that I achieved what I set out to do, which is to help heal those wounds. There's a huge responsibility when you take on writing about people, other people, particularly when they're dead, because they can't respond to you. So it was so imperative to me to make sure that everything I wrote was as not only factually accurate as possible, but also emotionally accurate as possible. We can write a lot of bad things about people, or not necessarily bad things, but we can be careless about what we write about people. And it was so important for me to not write one single careless fact in this book. And I had to think long and hard about, telling the story of my father, because the first question that comes to mind, this isn't my story to tell, this is his story. But he couldn't tell it. For whatever reason, he couldn't tell it. And I think there's something so important for us to realize, and I think we have to recognize people's suffering. If we don't recognize people's suffering, then I think we are lost. So I did come to the decision, okay, I'm going to tell the story of my father. But my siblings were all right behind me, which is unusual. A large family, everyone's different. I mean, everyone in my family is totally different. I can only speak for myself, my experiences. Each one of us have different memories, different character, different relationship with our parents. I mean, it's quite something.
Did your mother read any of your grandmother's books and was satisfied with what she wrote? Because you stated, I think, that your mother was never satisfied with things that were written about Dorothy Day. But was she satisfied with what Dorothy Day wrote? And did Dorothy Day write autobiographical things?
She wrote some autobiographical things. She was a very personal writer, so she did talk a lot about my mother and us growing up. Though she did it in ways that were, gentle and not obtrusive. But in terms of the question whether my mother read my grandmother's works, I can't really answer that. I know she read some. I don't know if she read, for example, The Long Holiness, my grandmother's memoir of her conversion. My mother once said that she found it difficult to read her mother's writings, and I don't really know why that is. She didn't really talk about that. So it's an interesting question, and I tried to get some kind of idea from my mother of what she had read, what she didn't, and how she felt about it. But, my mother was it was very interesting, these conversations I had with her, because my mother was a very interesting person, is that you could never ask her a direct question. You just could not. She would veer right away. She would not go near a direct question at all. So the way, I just kind of had to let her tell the story as she wanted to. It was on her terms. And that was one thing that I was never really able to establish. I know she did read one book that my grandmother wrote that was largely based on my mother's life in West Virginia. And I'm blanking out on the name of that one. I think it was the first one, Pilgrimage. It was published, I think, in the late 1940s. And it's a very short book, and it's largely about my mother's life in West Virginia. She was 24 years old, had 4 kids, and living on this very isolated farm. And my mother did not like that. She did not like that being very loud.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. What would you say are some things that maybe fictional portrayals of Dorothy Day have gotten wrong? Or, yeah.
No, the question is what fictional portrayals have gotten wrong about my grandmother. Where do I begin? Well, there's a couple of narratives that are really important for me to address in this book. And one is the narrative of what happened between my grandmother and my grandfather. There is this narrative that my grandfather left her because she became a Catholic. That wasn't the case at all. My grandmother left him, and she left him many times. It was very heartbreaking. It took 4 years. So that was the complexity of their relationship. Now, I couldn't, there's many things I don't know, and I really had to be kind of a detective in examining letters, diaries, my grandmother's writings, my mother's memories. I had to really kind of piece out. My grandfather was a hard person to really understand because he wasn't a writer. He didn't leave any diaries behind. He left 1 or 2 letters that I was able to discover. So there's a lot that I had to kind of, imagine. And the one way that I would imagine him was that he and my mother were so alike. I mean, I knew him a little bit. And their way of engaging the world was so similar to each other and very different from my grandmother. My grandmother was this talker, doer. When she loved to talk, she never stopped talking. She'd tell stories all the time. Fabulous storyteller. I loved listening to her fabulous voice. And my mother and grandfather were silent people. Very silent, so it was really hard to get a sense of him. But he was very complex, very intelligent, and he had a deep effect on my grandmother. And also another thing is they kept in contact throughout their entire lives, and not only did they keep in contact, for the last 10 years of my grandmother's life, they called pretty much every day. They really were very close. He would come over, my mother would come down to visit, he would come over, the 3 of them would visit. So there was, that kind of narrative of, he left her and that was the end of it. It's just not true. So that was one aspect. Another narrative that really pained my mother deeply was this idea that my grandmother was neglectful, that she was a neglectful mother. And this is something that just was so upsetting to my mother that she couldn't even speak to it. I mean, it would just leave her literally speechless when people would come up with that accusation. So there's this whole book kind of is a portrait of that relationship, totally difficult relationship. In many ways, mother-daughter relationships can be hell, and this one went through in stages, but an incredibly profound relationship that, to me, is probably the strongest relationship I have ever experienced. It was between my mother and my grandmother, just that bond, and that bond between 2 very, very different people, but 2 both powerful and wise, each in their own way. So those are 2 things that were absolutely essential for me to address in this book. So,
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit to what was, in a nutshell, what were the big rubs between what your mother was like and what your grandmother was like? What were their points of contention that made their relationship thorny at times? Can you speak to that at all? It was just simply personality differences?
well, there's definitely were personality differences and character differences, but there are some. My grandmother was very much a Day, and when I say a Day, the Day family, very interesting family. My grandmother wasn't the only interesting person in that family. One of the things in the Day family is that they had no time for education, for higher education. My grandmother's 2 older brothers quit school at the age of 15 and immediately became journalists, and very successful journalists, and very, one brother spoke 5 languages, and they very intelligent people, and they just had no use for, college, university. There was no use for it, no need. You could do what you needed to do without it. And my grandmother believed that too. You know, she dropped out of university after 2 years. My mother, on the other hand, believed highly of further education. And from her father's side of the family, the Batcham side of the family, they were degreed up to the hilt, you know, and they had been as both men and women from, you know, the turn of the 20th century. They were like, you know, her aunts were like the first women to get degrees, you know, master's degrees in mathematics or whatever. I mean, they're really powerful family, very highly educated, and that's what she was drawn to. And her mother kind of sabotaged it, you know. And that was probably the most difficult, the thing that they had to struggle with. Sorry, I just realized that I'm being filmed and probably just filming my neck. But I can't see them if I... so that was one, I think, really actually was the hardest and most enduring disagreement that they had was over
Did you
my...
not allow your mother to go for further education?
Well, my mother also made a mess of it too, so, you know, my grandmother, through a variety of missteps, kind of ruined my mother's high school years. And also, the problem also existed in that my mother had she learned differently, and now we would know what to do. Back then, they didn't know what to do. You know, back then, she was kind of, because she was slow to speak, slow to read, she was kind of labeled as, you know, not the brightest. Well, it turns out that my mother had her IQ was a level of a genius. She was no dummy, but she just had a different way of operating in the world. And, you know, back in the 30s, that wasn't often recognized. So part of it is not my grandmother's fault, you know, it's just the times that were in it. And then part of it was my mother's fault, because in her rebellious mood as a teenager, she got married at the age of 18 and then had 9 kids by the time she was 34. So that kind of slowed things down. She did eventually go back to college in her 50s. But she never quite felt that she had grabbed her vocation. You know, there was another topic that was so important for the two of them, finding your vocation. And she felt she was never able to find her vocation. So that really is probably the most profound disagreement between the two of them.
Yes.
How old were you when your grandmother died? And how much of your memories of your grandmother are your memories or your mom's memories?
I was 20 when she died, and spent a great deal of time with her from when I was born. Of course, I don't remember the early years, but she. I have a lot of memories of her, a lot, and some of my most. The memories that have had the most impact on me are actually quite simple. You know, they're not anything momentous. And also, then the last 3 years, well, before she was quite active. I mean, my grandmother had an incredible amount of energy. She was all over the place all the time. I mean, it's amazing how much she got done. And then she would be up with her mom, visiting us, and then, you know, she'd be back down to her, and she would go traveling across the country, traveling overseas. But she always made sure that she was visiting us probably, you know, every other month. Excuse me. So I did know her quite a bit, though, you know, when she was an active woman, it was very different than when she slowed down. 1976, when I was 16, she had a heart attack, and that really became the change of her life. She couldn't travel as much. Excuse me. I hope I'm not losing my voice.
I think it's got to be one of the last questions here.
So Dorothy, they seem to have a calling to mercy, and I could see that in the Catholic worker movement. How did she express mercy to you and your mother? And it seems like a therapy, it has nothing to do with the first question. But can you explain Dorothy Day's relationship with your other siblings?
All right, well, the second question I'll answer first. We all had a different relationship with her, depending on how old we were having children when my grandmother was still alive. A lot of kids. I have a lot of nieces and nephews. And none of them were married. And this was the 70s where people weren't getting married. My siblings were married very much young.